everyone, welcome to the webinar. I wanted to thank everyone to start for registering and attending. As always, your participation, registration, questions are all anonymous. We are so lucky to be joined by fabulous Johnson Law Group attorney, Rachel Amspoker. She is one of the attorneys at Johnson Law Group, and she is going to share some of her knowledge on annulments in Colorado. It's funny, we actually joke that she is the expert on annulments in our firm, so we are very lucky to have her presenting this specific topic today. We know that there will likely be questions, so we will have time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. You can just type your questions and answers into the Q&A or the chat box in the bottom of your screen, and I will read out the questions to Rachel in order to maintain the anonymity of the questions and participation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rachel, and she is going to get us started.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this webinar. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so just before we start out, I just wanted to do a quick disclaimer that this is not going to be legal advice and that this presentation does not create an attorney-client relationship. But yeah, so welcome to this presentation, and I'm hoping that we can get into a lot of good topics today. So what is an annulment? An annulment is a bit different from a divorce because it treats a marriage as though it never legally existed. Essentially, after an annulment is granted, it is like you were never married. The marriage was never valid, and that is just not on your record. So yeah, in Colorado, annulments are called a declaration of invalidity. In other states, they are called annulments, but here it's a declaration of invalidity. The process is very similar to a divorce. You're just going to go ahead and file that petition, some other relevant documents, and things like that. So to get an annulment in Colorado, you do have to be a resident of Colorado for 30 days before filing an action. However, if you were married in Colorado, you don't have to wait that 30-day period. So if you were married in another state and presently living in Colorado, that's when you would have to wait 30 days living in Colorado before filing the action. So a number of people also can start an annulment action, unlike a divorce when only the parties involved can file for the divorce. So either party to the marriage obviously can file for an annulment. The parents of an underage party could file for an annulment, as well as the state, the children of either party. Yeah, so the thing with annulments is that marriages can be invalid when they're prohibited by law. So that is one situation in which the state could get involved. That might be, as I'll talk a little bit later, in a situation where someone had two spouses or if someone was underage. So there can be other legal implications involved in an annulment. The process, again, to file for an annulment is very similar to a dissolution of marriage. Just need to file in the district court. You need to serve the other party, and the other party does have time to file a response. They could dispute the annulment. They could think that maybe the parties don't meet the legal qualifications for an annulment, or they could be totally on board with the annulment and file a response to say that they would like to move forward. So yeah, like I said a bit previously, the divorce assumes that the marriage was valid and that the couple was previously married. But in an annulment, your marriage was never valid and it takes effect as of the date of the marriage. It's retroactive. And also in an annulment, you have to prove a particular set of facts in order to qualify for it. In a divorce, you don't really have to prove anything. You just have to say that your marriage is irreconcilable, you have irreconcilable differences, So it can be often, it's always a lot easier to prove that, that you qualify for a divorce than an annulment. But they both do have the same effect in that they end the marriage. It just is based on the legal implications of whether the marriage existed in the first place. Yeah, so like I just said, it's maybe not legally viable for most people. Divorce can be simpler, especially if the facts are not on your side for an annulment. Yeah. So basically, the most important part of an annulment are what are actually the legal grounds for the annulment. There are different rules in different states, and there can be some confusion on that, but these are the grounds in Colorado. These first two are pretty easy to prove. One of the spouses was under the legal age of consent, or one of the spouses was already married. These are examples like I talked about before that are just illegal. You can't get married if you are under the legal age of consent. And bigamy is illegal also. So if you were married to somebody else and you got married again, you could annul that marriage, or if you were the party who got married to someone who was already married. For the third one of the spouses was unable to provide consent. This could be in a situation where the parties were drinking, there was drugs involved, and the marriage happened while people were under the influence. In that situation, if you were intoxicated, you were unable to provide consent. So you would just need to prove that you were intoxicated at that time, or the other party was intoxicated. Another example of a time when you are unable to provide consent would be due to maybe a mental disability. If you're unable to realize the legal relationship you're entering into with a divorce. And then another legal ground for annulment that goes to like whether the marriage was legal or illegal is whether the marriage was incestuous. That also has different definitions in different states, but typically a marriage between siblings or cousins is the one that depends on the state, but any sort of blood relationship can be an incestuous marriage. Yeah, moving to some other legal grounds of annulment. These ones are a bit harder to prove, and like they have some factors that you need that are contained within them that you also have to prove. So this first one is the marriage was not consummated because one of the spouses was physically unable and did not tell the other spouse. This is one that I've seen confusion in before, because in other states, if a marriage is not consummated, it can be annulled. That's not exactly the case in Colorado. You have to prove that one of the spouses is physically unable to consummate the marriage and that the other spouse did not know about that. Can be pretty hard to prove depending on the situation. So, you definitely want to make sure that you have all the evidence for that one. This one, for the fraudulent, the next legal ground for annulment. This one I feel is pretty popular, that people want to get an annulment based on fraud. But again, you do have to prove a number of things in order to qualify for this. In Colorado, there are some cases in which an annulment has been found because of fraud. One example might be a case that a wife who remarried her ex-husband because he told her that he had a terminal illness. That was not true. So she tried to get an annulment based on fraud because she wouldn't have married him if she had known that he didn't have a terminal illness. But actually, the Colorado courts found that that did not constitute an annulment, because the fraud really has to go to the heart and the essence of the marriage relationship. One pretty clear-cut example is if one spouse gets married to the other just for visa or citizenship benefits. You would have to prove that first, that the party who married for the benefits had that intention, that they only were marrying the party for visa benefits. And then you also would have to show that the other party was unaware at the time of marriage, and that later when they found out, they filed within the correct time, and also that they wouldn't have gotten married to the person had they known that it was only for the visa benefits. Yeah, and then moving to the next one of the spouses was forced into the marriage. So this is if you're compelled to get married to the other person based on a threat or violence or something like that. And then lastly, the parties entered into the marriage as a jest or as a dare. Also, this is really important, the statute of limitations. Statute of limitations essentially means deadlines within a case. You have to file your case within a certain amount of time after the events happened in order to have the legal grounds to file that case. So if you miss these deadlines, you wouldn't be able to get the declaration of invalidity. So this goes back to the factors for the legal grounds we just talked about. If your spouse lacked the ability to consent, you have to file within 6 months of learning that they lacked the ability to consent. For the consummation of the marriage, you have to file within 1 year of finding out that your spouse was unable to consummate the marriage. And then if one of the spouses was underage, you have 2 months or 2 years from the date of marriage to file. Yeah, here are some more of the statute of limitations. And again, I just want to note that all of these 6 months deadlines are based on the date you found out. So for the fraud, it wouldn't be when the fraud occurred. It would be when you found out about the fraud or when the other person found out about the fraud. Yeah, this is another element of an annulment that's a bit different from a divorce. There's a standard of proof because you need to prove that you qualify for the annulment. So the standard of proof for an annulment is just preponderance of the evidence. This just means one little step greater than 50%. So the judge would need to be convinced like 51% that what you are saying is true and accurate. So the impacts of an annulment versus divorce. Ultimately, it is the same that your marriage will end. But there are some differences, and there are some differences in terms of impact. So an annulment is allowed immediately after marriage. There isn't a waiting period like with divorce. So you could technically get your annulment a lot quicker. And after an annulment, the spouse is considered single or unmarried. After a divorce, the spouse is considered divorced. There are some religious and cultural benefits to annulment. That's just a personal preference. If you don't want to have a divorce due to your religion or your cultural beliefs, an annulment can definitely be preferable. However, you still do have to prove that you are qualified to have an annulment based on the legal grounds. And I just also want to note that although you can get an annulment quicker and you can get one immediately after, if the other party is contesting the validity of the annulment, then you might have to wait a longer time. You would still have to go through the process of a divorce and go through a hearing and put the case in front of the judge. But if both of you agree that the annulment is warranted, it might be a lot quicker and easier. Yeah, so as far as the topics that an annulment is going to cover, it still does cover child custody and child support, just like in a divorce. In other states, annulments sometimes do not cover child support and child custody to the extent that they would in a divorce, but Colorado provides protections for that. Neither an annulment nor divorce will impact the legitimacy of a child born during the marriage, and it won't affect their paternity. In Colorado, we have presumptions that a child born within a marriage, that the husband in the marriage is their father. That remains true in an annulment, just like a divorce. Yeah, so you can, even though you can file for an annulment immediately after a marriage, it can still be an option for older marriages as well. If you found out that your spouse only did marry you for visa benefits or something like that, and you found that out years later, you could still qualify for an annulment because of the statute of limitations and all that. Yeah, so an annulment can protect your property because property is typically not divided. It still can be divided, but typically it is not. Like I said earlier, if both parties agree and if the parties clearly fit into one of the legal grounds, an annulment can be much quicker than a divorce and much simpler. Also, what's interesting about an annulment is that you can immediately still qualify for spousal support from a prior marriage. So usually, if you were married previously and you're receiving spousal support from your ex, as soon as you get remarried, that spousal support would end. You're no longer eligible for the spousal support. However, if you got remarried and then that marriage was annulled, you would again be able to receive that spousal support from a prior marriage, as long as you're still within any time period that you might have designated from your previous marriage. Yeah, unlike in a divorce, there's no automatic protective orders in effect. There also aren't necessarily the financial protective orders that the automatic temporary injunction that goes into place in a divorce proceeding. So you might want to consider that if you're considering an annulment versus a divorce. Yeah, and I think that is all I have. I can put it back to Sarah for any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So as Rachel mentioned, now would be a perfect time for questions. You can feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section or into the chat box on the lower part of your screen. If you do not have any questions or you have a more personal question that you would like to ask, you can feel free to email us at info@johnsonlgroup.com. And we will get back to you as soon as possible. You can also give us a call at 720-452-2540, and we will put you in contact with the appropriate attorney. If you'd like to speak with Rachel, we can certainly put you in contact with her and she can answer any questions that you have. I'm not seeing any questions, Rachel. But like I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us via email or phone, and we are happy to answer any questions that you have. We do have other webinars coming up. Rachel is doing another webinar, not next week, but the following week. And you can stay up to date on all of those webinars by visiting our YouTube channel and by also following us on social media. So I guess thank you everyone for registering and attending. Thank you, Rachel, for being an excellent presenter and sharing your knowledge with us. And I hope to see everyone at the next webinar.
Bye, thank you.